the only one we can rely on. Hail up the conquering lion. Most lighter, you're the only one we can rely on. In a prison, in a jungle.
And now, very, very, very interesting development here. Something that we definitely had sought to get into much more on, as far as keeping up with, again, the economic systems that are being shuffled around. But here's so coming from the Moscow Times, and we'll actually follow up with this one from the Vineyard of the Saker. The Saker is someone I'd love for the rest of our Rastafari constituency, the fellowship, and other adherents to actually get into a bit more. I was actually alerted to a lot of the Saker's works after seeing him with a one Sheikh Imran Hussein. And I was actually even alerted to Sheikh Imran Hussein, who's of course a Muslim of, we would say more an East Indian or Pakistani background, but a very sharp brother, even for a very I guess we would say elderly person, you know, a bit up there in age, but, you know, that doesn't slow him down from his study, from a lot of his writing. You know, very interesting person, just to say the least. Very versed on international affairs. And I would say that if one's, you know, like the, or at least tune into much of the reports that we actually do here on the Rasta World News and Views, here on Upper Room of Zion, the Saker, and also Sheikh Imran Hussein are two people that we definitely recommend. Sheikh Imran Hussein, I was alerted to him by our brethren, Wyndham Yallen, of course, some years ago, and I've just kept up with a lot of the works that he has been putting out, because even so, as a Muslim, he is very straightforward, very straight to the point, and even so, much of the delivery of the messages come through a Islamic perspective, but in the same sense, still reign true in the holistic perspective of how things are actually shifting and going, especially within international affairs, even on down to the local level, you know, wherever ones may be at this particular time. So a lot to be had there, a lot to be researched as far as these two individuals, and you know, much to be brought about again. But the Saker also a white Russian, and not just in a sense of what we know as a white Russian today. That's a term that ones actually even have to look up for themselves. A white Russian, look that up, and that will kind of bring you up to speed on not only the ideology of a one Saker, but also the historical context of what that is and how that constitutes what ones will be hearing from a one there at the Vineyard of the Saker. But here's so getting into Russia's top banks plot temporary sanctions workaround. This coming from Reuters. This is the entitled article here from the Moscow Times by way of Reuters. Dated here March 14th, 2019. Again, as we mentioned before, this is something we have been keeping some eyes on. And of course, many ones have heard a lot about Russia buying up a lot of gold, physical gold, as well as you know, gold bonds and stocks, so on and so forth, you know, to hedge against a lot of inflation and other sanctions that have been imposed upon them in this great and international scope of things, as far as trade wars, so on and so forth. But getting right here into the reading, leading Russian banks are working on plans to help each other retain at least short-term access to the global financial system in the event that they are hit by fresh U.S. sanctions. Sources familiar with the matter told Reuters. Sberbank Bank, VTB, and Gazprom Bank and others are examining how they can provide each other with access to U.S. dollars or other major foreign currencies by using so-called correspondent accounts, the sources said. Banks access financial services in different jurisdictions and provide cross-border payment services to customers in various currencies through correspondent banking relationships. The new scheme, which banks started to draft with Russia's finance minister and the central bank last year, would be unlikely to work indefinitely, but could help avoid a panic if one of several big banks are cut off from dollar transactions. U.S. lawmakers last year drafted a sanctions bill which proposed cutting off some of Russia's top banks from the U.S. dollar system, mentioning Sberbank, VTB, Gazprombank, Russian Agriculture Bank, Promzvia Bank, VEB, and the Bank of Moscow. This did not come into force, and recently another was proposed without mentioning any specific banks. But Russian banks still fear they could come under sanctions and so have begun to draft a contingency plan. Each important bank has a step-by-step plan on what should be done in a given situation. The first month is set out day by day, if not hour by hour, a senior finance official said. The central bank and Gazprombank declined to comment. The finance minister, Sberbank, VTB, Promzvia Bank, VEB, and the Russian Agriculture Bank did not reply to requests for comment. The two biggest threats to the banking sector in Russia are being cut off from the SWIFT banking messaging system and losing access to foreign currency, which they usually get from U.S. banks via correspondent accounts. In the event of being shut out of SWIFT, Russia already has its own system, which it is upgrading. And for foreign currencies, there are a number of options, said the sources, who include a high-ranking state banker, a well-placed industry official, an executive with a large bank, and an individual in a foreign bank. So the temporary fix. The main option relies on at least one major Russian bank avoiding sanctions and being able to retain access to foreign currencies via correspondent accounts with major overseas banks. Other Russian banks would then set up or upgrade existing correspondent accounts with that bank to shift currencies around. Publicly available documents show VTB has correspondent accounts with Sberbank and VEB, while the Russian Agriculture Bank has accounts with VEB, VTB, Gazprombank, Sberbank, and a number of other Russian banks. VEB has such accounts with Sberbank and Gazprombank. Sberbank, VTB, VEB, Gazprombank, and the Russian Agriculture Bank have correspondent accounts with the central bank as well. However, the bulk of these accounts are denominated in rubles, which is the Russian currency, with only a handful of US dollars and euros. This would allow them to move the dollars between themselves bypassing a correspondent account, the source at a foreign bank said, adding that in order for the backup to work, one bank in the chain would need to have a US dollar correspondent account with a US bank, as there would still be a need to make external settlements, necessitating a bridge. Correspondent accounts would complicate tracking currency transfers between the banks, making them harder for overseas authorities to spot, a former central bank official said. Such an agreement would represent a temporary solution, quote unquote, which might last for 3 or 4 months and buy the banks time to find an alternative while also reassuring customers. And a spike in currency transactions by the bank, which had not been sanctioned, and were dealing with the foreign correspondent bank, would likely arouse suspicions. Other options include the central bank providing forex currency to a clean bank, quote unquote, which in turn would then distribute it to peers via correspondent accounts, sources said. Alternatively, a sanctioned bank could use correspondent accounts directly with the central bank, although that would raise the risk of the central bank itself being hit with sanctions and therefore is unlikely, the sources said. So yet and still, just getting into that, hopefully ones were able to keep up with a lot of the information that was being shared here. As we mentioned before, Russia has been also acquiring a lot of gold, as per many of the sanctions that have come forward to many of the establishments within the financial sector of the said country of Russia, and also the country of Russia itself, with its many dealings on an international scale. But even so, we mentioned quite a few times there in this article, the SWIFT banking system. And this is what we actually will get into as far as the Sankers report here. So to bring ones up to speed here, we're at the Sankers site, the Vineyard of the Saker, and actually report done just a year or so ago, January 4th, 2018, entitled Russia Without SWIFT. For some time now, U.S. and its vessel states and Russia are engaged in an economic war. The first salvo was when Visa and MasterCard, which are U.S.-based banking institutions, were forced to stop accepting transactions performed by cardholders of certain Russian banks. The latest indication, as the Saker has mentioned in the near past, is that the U.S. government is thinking to block Russian access to the SWIFT system. So what is the SWIFT? SWIFT is basically a cooperative message exchange system. It is targeted at banks, investment companies, more brokers, basically anyone which needs to transfer money from A to B. To use it, you apply for membership. Once accepted, you get your SWIFT code plus some shares of the SWIFT cooperative, pay a one-off sign-up fee, and from then on you pay per message, aka transaction, or per file sent, other processing and or services fees, plus an annual support fee. The value of fees and other charges depends on the membership level. Profits are distributed in a similar way. SWIFT also provides reports and other analytic features to help members generate more business. The reason behind SWIFT's success is the fact that it provides a standardized, secure, and reliable way of moving money around. Regulatory compliance is expensive as it requires constant, dedicated, high-quality manpower to monitor, develop, implement, test, and deploy changes to IT systems and networks as well as business processes. Thus, banks and other financial institutions prefer to have someone else take care of all such requirements. So the impact of kicking Russia out of SWIFT, if it was possible. The immediate effect will be the inability to exchange SWIFT messages between Russian members of the SWIFT system and the rest. Note that SWIFT itself does not facilitate the actual money transfer. All it does is exchanging money orders. The fund transfer must take place using mechanisms and under the agreements that the two exchanging institutions already have in place. As such, while it will become more risky and difficult to transfer money, not to mention more expensive, more transfers cannot be completely stopped. Such difficulties will drive Russian investors to seek other, more investor-friendly destinations for their money. This will probably hit the European Union or the EU quite hard, as it is a favorable place for Russian investment. Consider this scenario. You have $1 million which you'd like to invest. You go to your bank, tell them you'd like to transfer said $1 million to X country, and the teller comes back and says, "We can do that. However, it is deemed high risk, and as such, please sign a waiver that if something happens to your $1 million, the bank bears zero responsibility." Of course, you can insist to proceed with the transfer. However, a safe bet is that the majority of people will choose a less risky destination. SWIFT also stands to lose. Communication is a two-way street, which means messages go from and to Russia. If one assumes that 10 million daily Russian-related messages per day between SWIFT members at the rate of 0.1 euro per message, that is 36,500,000 euros per year in transaction fees alone. There is a good chance that a number of Russian institutions will either be removed or otherwise decide on their own that there is no more meaning in being a SWIFT member. Therefore, will be a loss of other fees, not to mention the cost of all the legal battles to sort out the contractual agreements. So can Russia build an alternative to SWIFT? Technically speaking, yes. In response to Visa's and MasterCard's boycott, Russia has launched the NSPK as a replacement bank card scheme. Allow me to make a few points, as the reader, or at least the writer here, says. The NSPK, as it stands now, it is a card payment system and a direct response to the coercion by the U.S. government to Visa and MasterCard not to honor their arguments or their agreements with Russian banks and stop accepting their own cards for which Russian banks pay licensing fees for the privilege of issuing them. The first 6 digits on any of your bank cards are called the BIN number. The logo on the card, Visa, Amex or American Express, MasterCard, etc., shows which scheme owns the BIN. Your bank, the issuer, pays said scheme a license fee to exclusively use that particular BIN, and as such, the scheme has to honor their end of the deal. That is, ensuring the card is accepted by all terminals brandishing the same logo. Few people know that Visa et al. Are in reality banking institutions. The NSPK scheme has been active for a couple of years now. Already a number of Russian banks use it. For the time being, it operates only within Russia. The first iteration of a Russianized clone of China's UnionPay scheme, which is in itself is based off Visa specs or specifications properly licensed. I always laugh when thinking of the irony. Instead of Visa making money out of card transactions made by Russians, they lose money while Russia is using their own design. Russia can choose to repeat this by enhancing NSPK to function as a SWIFT alternative. NSPK could use the same file formats and mechanisms with SWIFT with direct or different headers to allow proper identification, thus minimizing needed system modifications on behalf of users. A big plus in this effort is that SWIFT messages are using an ISO standard, namely ISO 222. This will make development a whole lot easier since ISO 222 is an open standard. No one can use any copyright claims to stop the alternative solution. Next comes the question of the actual communications between the users of the new system. While everybody is using the internet these days, few people realize that it relies on a backbone of backbones. A series of high-capacity cables, usually underwater, and satellites linked to extremely high-end routers utilizing the BGP protocol to set up the paths for intra-county linking. While quite a few entities can own a satellite or an underwater cable, only a handful have the technical know-how and expertise to create such infrastructure. The U.S. can go full retard and force the owners of such backbone elements, say AT&T, to block certain messages originating from Russia. Thankfully, Russia is quite capable of building and deploying its own satellites and cables. It will be costly and time-consuming, but it can be done. At first, existing infrastructure can be used for establishing communications between important business partners, most likely in Asia. Finally, the big question is who will be accepting any SWIFT alternative. Here is where things get tough. The U.S. is certain to try and bully other countries into either using SWIFT exclusively or else. This can even be achieved via the ethical way, like it was attempted way back when Google cited pressure from society and people to promote democracy and freedom of speech, quote-unquote, in an effort to try to avoid following Chinese legislation while doing business in China. While users in countries like China probably will not be intimidated, who would like to lose Chinese investments or can be allowed to work around the limits? For an example, keep the main business entity SWIFT only and set up a subsidiary for Russian-only communications. The subsidiary is as such expendable, and if one complains, it can be dissolved and replaced within a matter of days. Smaller or vassal states, like the EU, can be bullied enough to go against their own interests. This has happened in the past between Visa and China's UnionPay, and it took years of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, litigation to resolve. Russian diplomacy will have to be very efficient and creative to overcome a global monopoly. And this report here from the Vineyard of the Saker gives a bit more insight and quite a bit of history, even so on up until this point in the present day, as to what's going on as far as the unseen, or at least we would say kind of the shrouded economic wars that are going on between even so many of the trade wars between many of the countries that are yet and still out in the forefront as of today.
Yes, I. Go. Knick-knack, paddywhack, Hebrew cows back. When I grab the microphone, we can get brat. You shine, I'ma dim that. Spitting all that weak rap. My words is like a big gat. I'm working with the kickback. Aiming where you lit at. Warlord, swing a heavy sword. Take heads off in the name of our Lord. It's a massacre in the name of all that's holy. I promise this Babylon system can't contain the homie. Burn fire. In the face of all them liars, if you the most high, Rastafari the most higher, check your doctrine. I blaze the Aisha and enter in, kneel before the altar and confess each and every sin. Turn toward Jah and repent from your evil ways. Separate from heathen living in these very last days. Plagues and famine, crooked cops committing murder. It's GMOs in your McDonald's hamburger. What you doing? The temple become ruined, and the glory that you're pursuing will eventually do you, and that's fact. And there ain't no coming back. Liberty off track. Pick it up, put it back. You can do it. Yeshua already proved it. Keep Jah in your heart, and you will get through it. Mountains moving, seas parting. Clear the way. The line of the tribe of Judah shout. Break every chain. Hail the King. House Selassie, I and I, Lord and Savior, needless to guess Rastafari. Provide the righteous teachings for the whole church body. Yeah.